Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters don't live in the shadows. They live right next door. They mow their lawns, wave to their neighbors, and sit beside you in church. You'd never notice the darkness hiding behind their polite smiles until it's too late. In the small, peaceful city of Wichita, Kansas, people lived simple, quiet lives. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where kids rode their bikes until sunset and neighbors left their doors unlocked. But beneath that calm surface, something was waiting, something that would change the meaning of safety forever. During the early 1970s, Wichita was the heart of American suburbia. Families were growing, businesses were thriving, and the air was full of optimism. But on a cold January morning in 1974, that illusion of safety shattered. A phone call came into the Wichita Police Department. A neighbor had found something terrible inside a small house on Edgemore Street. When the first officers arrived, they were met with silence. The house was still, the air heavy, like it was holding its breath. Nothing could prepare them for what they found inside. A family, a father, a mother, 2 children gone, no signs of robbery, no forced entry, just a scene that made even the most seasoned detective go pale. The officers left the house that day knowing one thing. This wasn't random, it was personal, deliberate, and controlled. Whoever had done it hadn't acted in rage. They had taken their time. For Wichita, the nightmare had begun. News spread quickly. Headlines spoke of the Edgemore murders, but no one had a clue who was behind it. The victims, a kind, hard-working family, had no enemies. It didn't make sense, and that's exactly how the person responsible wanted it. Weeks turned into months. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, chased countless leads, and still nothing. Then, just when the city began to breathe again, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. It was handwritten, full of spelling errors, and yet disturbingly confident. The writer claimed to be the one behind the murders. He described details that were never released to the public. He bragged about his work, saying he liked to study his victims before acting. And then, at the bottom of the letter, 3 chilling letters appeared. B.T.K. He explained what they meant. Bind them, torture them, kill them. The signature was more than a name. It was a promise, a declaration, a game he wanted to play with the police and the media. From that moment, Wichita would never sleep the same again. Detectives now knew they weren't dealing with an impulsive killer. They were dealing with someone who planned, someone who wanted recognition. BTK didn't just want to kill, he wanted to be known. He wanted fame, fear, and attention. Over the next months, more strange incidents followed. A young woman was attacked in her home. Her brother survived, but couldn't identify the man. The details, the way the scene was arranged, the way the crime was executed, carried the same signature. It was methodical, almost ritualistic. Police worked around the clock, but BTK always seemed one step ahead. He was organized, cautious, and incredibly patient. He studied routines, learned habits, and struck when no one expected it. And then, he disappeared. For years, nothing. No letters, no attacks, just silence. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence of someone watching, waiting, enjoying the chaos he'd created behind the mask. To everyone else, Dennis Rader was the picture of normal. A husband, a father, a church leader, a city worker, the kind of man you'd trust to feed your dog while you were away. He was polite, meticulous, and deeply involved in his community. He led a local church council, helped organize community events, and even worked as a compliance officer, enforcing city codes and making sure everyone followed the rules. But that's the thing about masks. The tighter you wear them, the easier it becomes to believe they're real. At home, Rader lived a quiet, suburban life. He mowed his lawn every Saturday morning, waved to neighbors, and tucked his children into bed each night. But deep down, something else was growing: a need for control, a fascination with power, and an obsession with the feeling of dominance. He kept journals, carefully organized, where he documented his thoughts, not in detail about what he did, but about how he felt. He wrote about projects, about fantasies, about the thrill of planning something so perfectly that no one could trace it back to him. The real world never satisfied him. He wanted a secret life, one where he could play God. When he looked at people on the street, he didn't see faces. He saw opportunities. He called it trolling, searching for the next project. He told himself it wasn't wrong if he didn't act, but deep down, he knew that moment would come again. And when it did, he would feel alive. Fear takes over Wichita. By the late 1970s, BTK had become more than just a name. He was a ghost story. Parents told their children to keep the doors locked. Women started checking every shadow. Wichita, once a city of trust, had turned into a city of fear. The police formed a special task force. Dozens of officers working day and night, analyzing letters, studying patterns, comparing handwriting, interviewing suspects. Every lead ended in frustration. They received prank calls, false confessions, even people trying to become BTK for fame. But the real one? He was watching from the sidelines, smiling. Every few years, he'd send another letter, just enough to remind everyone he was still out there. He taunted the police, mocked the investigation, and played with the media like puppets. In one message, he even compared himself to Jack the Ripper, saying he deserved his own chapter in history. What no one realized was that during all this time, Dennis Rader was sitting in his living room, watching TV with his family, reading the same headlines about himself. To the world, he was the man who volunteered at church. To himself, he was the man who had fooled everyone. The double life. In psychology, there's a term, compartmentalization. It's the ability to divide your life into separate boxes, sealing each one away so you never have to face the full picture. Rader had perfected it. He could attend Sunday service in the morning, shake hands with the pastor, then spend the afternoon writing about his projects. He could discipline his children for misbehavior, then lose himself in fantasies of control. To him, these worlds didn't collide, they balanced each other. He once wrote that his darker side had a name, Factor X. He described it as a force that drove him to seek control, to test limits, to outsmart others. In his mind, it wasn't evil, it was destiny. For years, this balance held. He lived two lives, the respected citizen and the hidden shadow. The longer he maintained the illusion, the stronger his confidence grew. And that's when arrogance took over. A ghost returns. After 1991, the letters stopped. No more signs of BTK. Wichita began to heal. New generations grew up, barely remembering the horror of the 70 seconds and 80 seconds. Then, in 2004, 3 decades after the first killings, a local TV station received a mysterious envelope. Inside were photographs and documents from an old case file, along with a message written in the same strange handwriting: "I have been watching you. The game is not over." The police froze. Could it be possible? Could BTK still be alive, still in Wichita? They reopened the case. New detectives joined, armed with modern technology, DNA testing, computer forensics, digital tracking, but they had little to work with. The only clue was the arrogance in his words, the same tone that had defined him decades ago. And arrogance, as it turns out, would be his downfall. For nearly a decade, Ravenfield had been silent. The city had learned to live with its unsolved mystery, the case that sat in a locked drawer at the back of every detective's mind. Then, one winter morning, a single envelope arrived at the local newspaper. It carried no return address, just a faint scent of printer ink, and the words, "To the editor, because truth needs an audience." Inside was a short letter, typed on an aging computer. The author spoke of unfinished business, of corrections that must be made. At first, the editor thought it was another crank note, but attached to the letter were several old photographs, blurred shots of police cars, a familiar street sign, a child's toy half buried in snow. Detective Elena Hart, who had worked the Ravenfield cold files for years, recognized the pattern instantly. She'd seen the same brand of arrogance before the writer's need to feel smarter than everyone else. She called it the itch for acknowledgement. It was what separated an ordinary liar from someone who built an entire identity around the illusion of control. The police reopened the case quietly, not wanting the media storm to ignite again. They re-examined every file, every photograph, every inch of evidence that had survived the years. Technology had changed, so had the tools. Now they could read traces that once seemed invisible. Tiny bits of digital metadata, fragments of DNA that had been useless decades ago. Still, whoever had written that letter had taken precautions. No fingerprints, no return path. A ghost that spoke only when it wanted to. But ghosts make mistakes. Threads in the web. Daniel Cole had always believed the perfect plan was one that looked ordinary. When the city issued new ID cards for employees, he volunteered to help distribute them. When the church needed someone to manage its mailing lists, he took that job too. Each task gave him what he loved most: access. Access to data, to people, to information that made him feel omniscient. He thought of it as maintenance, keeping the world in order. Every rule he enforced, every form he signed, was a reminder that he was in control. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the house went still, and even the furnace seemed to hold its breath, the order turned fragile. Doubt began to whisper through the cracks. He started writing again, not letters this time, but digital journals hidden inside encrypted folders. He called them records of observation. In them, he didn't describe actions, he described feelings. The pulse of excitement when no one suspected, the irritation when someone ignored a regulation, the quiet rush of power when others obeyed without question. He told himself it was harmless, an intellectual exercise, but the itch returned. The same arrogance that once made him feel invisible now pushed him to prove that he still mattered. The bait. Detective Hart knew arrogance better than anyone. It was the same weakness she'd used to catch corporate fraudsters, hackers, and stalkers who couldn't resist leaving a signature. They always circle back to the scene of their own myth, she told her partner. They need the audience. So she designed a trap that looked like applause. The police published a short article on the newspaper's website, a retrospective piece titled 20 Years of Silence, the Ravenfield Mystery That Faded Away. It read like closure, as if the case were nothing more than an old rumor. The byline carried a subtle invitation, hidden in a phrase Daniel himself had used in one of his first letters years earlier. Rules are only perfect when followed. 2 weeks passed. Then an email arrived at the editor's desk. Simple subject line, correction. The writer pointed out a mistake in the article and attached a document to clarify the truth. The file was an outdated format, a small DAT archive that few modern computers could open. Inside were scanned pages of old police reports, scribbled with annotations, and a single digital watermark linking back to a city computer. It was exactly what Hart needed. Unraveling the perfect mask, they traced the watermark to the municipal building where Daniel worked. The data trail wasn't direct. It went through several public terminals, but one stood out. It had logged in using a city ID card just minutes before the file was created. Hart didn't rush the arrest. She knew this kind of man didn't break under pressure. He cracked under precision. The team began shadowing him, quietly, tracking his routes, his habits, his endless routines. He was predictable, almost mechanical, as if repetition itself kept his secret intact. Then, one night, Daniel noticed a small inconsistency. A car parked across from his house twice in the same week. A clerk at City Hall who lingered too long when handing him forms. The illusion of control began to fracture. He wrote one final message, this time to the police directly. "If you want the truth, you'll have to follow the rules. My rules." But Hart had already learned his language. Every rule he made was another wall he built, and walls, she knew, always left shadows. The fall. When they finally approached him, Daniel didn't run. He greeted them at the door with the same measured calm he'd used his entire life. The badge on his shirt still read, "Compliance Division." It was almost poetic. Inside his office, neatly labeled folders lined the shelves. Each contained ordinary documents, inspection forms, neighborhood reports, property maps. But within the data archives of his computer were hidden folders nested like Russian dolls, one inside another, until the last contained a single line of text. "Perfection is obedience. Obedience is peace." Hart stared at the screen, the words glowing faintly like an echo of a mind that had long mistaken control for morality. She realized he hadn't wanted chaos. He'd wanted worship. When questioned, Daniel didn't deny anything. Instead, he talked about balance, about the necessity of order, about how rules kept the world from falling apart. He spoke like a preacher defending a gospel only he understood. For the first time in decades, the city of Ravenfield felt its heartbeat return. People gathered on the courthouse steps, not for fear, but for closure. The quiet house with the perfect lawn stood empty, its windows reflecting the sky like mirrors that no longer hid anything. Detective Hart filed her final report under one word: resolved. The trial was short. Daniel Cole didn't resist. He never once pleaded insanity. When the prosecutor described his actions, his manipulations, his letters, his quiet orchestration of fear, he only listened, nodding slightly, as if they were all reciting the same script he'd written years before. He asked for no defense. He simply said, "The truth doesn't need permission." The court didn't understand him, but Detective Elena Hart did. She saw it in his eyes. The quiet satisfaction of a man who believed even his punishment proved his importance. The cameras, the whispers, the endless speculation, he had what he always wanted: attention, order, a legacy. When the verdict came, the city exhaled. For the first time in years, Ravenfield felt light again. The streets that once carried unease now carried laughter. People spoke of closure, of safety, of the past finally buried. The newspapers stopped printing his name. But silence, Elena knew, was never the same twice. Aftermath. She stayed on the force, though part of her wanted to leave. Every time she filed another case report, every time she locked another suspect's file into the archive, she thought of Daniel's folders. How clean they were, how methodical. The difference between order and obsession had become a thin line she could feel pressing against her every day. At night, she dreamed of his office, the smell of ink and paper, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of a man explaining why control was the only kind of love he understood. She began to visit the house sometimes, quietly, long after it was sealed off and abandoned. The neighbors had stopped looking that way. The grass grew tall again. Birds nested under the roof. The house was peaceful now. Too peaceful. The whisper returns. 3 months after the sentencing, the local paper received another envelope. This time, no letter, just a photograph. It showed a single desk under a fluorescent light, empty, except for a page. On that page, a sentence written in sharp, mechanical letters. Someone must keep the rules. The metadata said it was taken 3 days earlier inside a government office, late at night. No one could trace who sent it. Hart stared at it for hours. The handwriting was identical to Daniel's, but he was already behind bars, without access to any form of communication. The cell had been checked, the visitors recorded. Everything was accounted for. So how did the echo reach them? Fragments of control. Hart reopened her notes, not officially, but in secret. She began to see patterns again. Tiny details, forms filed with the same precision Daniel used to favor. Inspection reports signed with odd phrasing. Rules, maintain peace. Coincidence, her superiors said. But to Hart, coincidence was a luxury only the innocent could afford. She visited the prison once. He looked older, pale under the harsh lights, eyes dull, but still carrying that strange glint of understanding. He smiled when he saw her. "You've been reading my work again," he said softly. "I didn't write it," she replied. "You think words belong to their writers? They don't belong to monsters." "Then what are you doing here, detective?" he whispered. "Trying to understand your reflection?" She left before the guards could finish the conversation, but his words lingered. "Trying to understand your reflection." The mirror. Months passed. Ravenfield moved on. The old case became a documentary, then a podcast, then a cautionary tale told in classrooms about control and morality. People debated Daniel's psychology online, turning him into a story, a myth again. Elena avoided those discussions. But late at night, when the world was quiet and her apartment filled with the glow of her desk lamp, she caught herself arranging papers in perfect order, aligning the edges, naming folders with precise, symmetrical letters, the same way he used to. That realization froze her. Was she fighting monsters, or slowly learning to become one? She shut the folders, turned off the light, and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, she didn't move. She let the chaos exist, the crooked picture frame, the unsorted notes, the imperfection of being human. In that silence, she understood what Daniel never did. Control was never peace. Peace was letting go. Epilogue. The house on Alder Street. A year later, the house on Alder Street was sold. The new owners repainted the walls, tore out the old floorboards, and filled the rooms with laughter. They never knew who had lived there before. They didn't need to. But beneath the fresh paint, deep inside the wall where Daniel once hid his letters, a fragment of paper remained yellowed, almost invisible, its ink fading with time. It read, "Order is not the absence of chaos. It is the fear of feeling alive." The wind brushed through the cracks of the window frame, carrying the words into the empty night. No one heard them. No one needed to, because the echo had finally gone quiet. The end.